In this video, we're going to look at an example with rates and ratios that have fractions in them. So we're going to start with a situation where someone is walking 20 feet every 1/3 of a minute. So every 1/3 of a minute, we get 20 feet. So there's a few ways we can go about that. I'm going to do it first algebraically, actually, and then I'm going to go through kind of the diagram way. So if we're trying to figure out the unit rate, we're going to figure out how far is it going in 1 minute. So we have Bob. Bob's working 20 feet in 1/3 of a minute. We want to figure out how far does Bob walk in 1 minute. So we're going to try to get from 1/3 to 1 by either multiplying or dividing. So that kind of connects some fraction stuff we need to know. 1/3 times what is going to give me 1? Well, 1/3 times 3 is what gives you 1. 1/3 times 3. One way that we could think about that is 3 is the same thing as 3 over 1, which is very important. If you don't know that, off to the side. 3 is the same thing as 3 over 1. 10 is the same thing as 10 over 1. Because remember that over is division. And when we divide a number by 1, it doesn't change. So then at that point, we could see we multiply straight across. We get 1 times 3 is 3. 3 times 1 is 3. And we get 1. So we can know then, the most important takeaway here is that 1/3 times 3 is going to give me 1. So at that point then, I can go up to my 20 feet, multiply by 3. 20 times 3, 0 times 3 is 0, 2 times 3 is 6. So we're going to get 60 feet. So Bob walks 60 feet in 1 minute. If Bob walks 20 feet for every 1/3 minutes. All right, let's think about that a little bit less algebraically. So that's the idea. What if I want to create a picture? So in my picture, I'm going to split 1 into thirds. So I'm going to make this 1/3 of a minute. This another 1/3 of a minute. And this another 1/3 of a minute. So in total, we have 1 minute because we have 3 1/3. This 1/3 corresponds with Bob walking 20 feet. This 1/3 corresponds with Bob walking another 20 feet. And this 1/3 represents with Bob walking another 20 feet. Every 1/3 of a minute, he's walking 20 feet. So at that point, if we're trying to figure out the total in that 1 minute, we add 20 plus 20 plus 20, which is 20 times 3, just like we did up here. And we're going to get 60 feet. So that's a way of thinking about it in terms of a diagram.
Okay, and now let's take a look at our second example. So we're told that Taylor walks 20 yards in 2/3 of a minute. What is Taylor's unit rate in yards per minute? So how many yards is she walking in 1 minute, right? Because remember when we see per right here, right, that's an important math word that's saying like 4/1, and it's telling us we're looking for our unit rate. Okay, so we've got to set up our rate and then try to find an equivalent rate, equivalent ratio. That's our unit rate. So Taylor walks 20 yards, YD, that's an abbreviation for yards, in 2/3 of a minute. And we're asked to find her unit rate, so how many yards she's going to walk in 1 minute. So just like before, even though we have a little bit of a harder fraction, we're doing the same thing. We're asking ourselves, how do you get from 2/3 to 1? So it's kind of like 2/3 by multiplying or dividing. So we could think of it either way. 2/3 times what number is going to equal 1? Or we could do 2/3 divided by what number is going to give me 1. Okay, so ultimately we're doing the same thing either way, which we're going to look at. So let's start with division because I think that's a little easier. So we think about 2/3 divided by what gives me 1. We know that any number divided by itself equals 1. So that means that includes fractions, it includes decimals. So here I have 2/3 divided by, it's going to have to be 2/3. 2/3 divided by 2/3 equals 1. So what I could do, and if you have a calculator, this might be the easiest, is I could go from 2/3 to 1, I could divide by 2/3. Right, and then I could do the same thing, of course, with my numerator to figure out the answer. But the problem is without a calculator, dividing by 2/3, you end up needing to change that into multiplication. So let's think about what that would mean. You learned, I know in 6th grade, and a lot of us seem to remember this pretty well, keep, change, flip, right? That was like your mnemonic device to remember the idea that when you divide by a number, that's the same thing as multiplying by the number's reciprocal or the flip. So dividing by 2/3 is the same as multiplying by 3/2. That's the same. Dividing by a number is the same thing as multiplying by the number's reciprocal. So let's check that. So that's saying that instead of dividing by 2/3, what I could do is I could multiply by 3/2. Okay, let's see, that is correct. Let's see why that is if I look at what I get when I multiply. So this is an important skill, so if we've forgotten how to do this, pay close attention. How do we multiply fractions? Well, to multiply fractions, you just multiply straight across, meaning you look at your numerators, multiply across, look at the denominators, multiply across. So on my numerators, I have times 3, and my denominators, I'm going to have 3 times 2. Okay, and what is 2 times 3? That is 6. What is 3 times 2? That is 6. So then what is 6 divided by 6? 6/6. Any number divided by itself is 1. So we get 1 there. Right, and we're going to get that every single time. So a general rule is if I have a fraction here, like 2/3, to get to 1, I can multiply by its reciprocal or its flip. Or reciprocal is the good math word I want you to use. Its flip, which is 3/2 in this case, where you switch 2 and 3. So then that's what I'm going to do up here. I'm going to multiply by 3/2. If you have a calculator, you could also divide by 2/3, right? And those are the same thing. Okay? All right, so let's clear up our board space a little bit. Let's go ahead and do this. So we know that 2/3 times 3/2 equals 1. We already figured that out. So now we're going to do the same thing with the numerator. I have 20, and I need to multiply by my 3/2. And we got to figure out what that equals. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do, which I did my last problem as well, is that if I have 20, just an integer like that, I want to turn that into a fraction in order to multiply. So I can turn 20 into the equivalent fraction 20/1, or 20 divided by 1, because any number divided by 1 is itself. Right, 20 divided by 1 is 20, 100 divided by 1 is 100. So 20 and 20 divided by 1 are the same thing. And now we have fractions, so we can just multiply straight across. Okay, so 20 times 3, that is 60. And 1 times 2 is 2. So I'm going to get 60 divided by 2. And then lastly, I just need to divide that out. 60 divided by 2. So 60/2, or 60 divided by 2, that is 30. Okay, so we get that we go 30 yards in 1 minute. Okay, so if Taylor's walking 20 yards in 2/3 of a minute, then she's walking 30 yards in 1 minute. And since this is a word problem, right, it's good to have that unit. So the unit rate is 30 yards per minute. In 1 minute, she's walking 30 yards. Okay, and finally we're going to look at one last example that has fractions in both the numerator and the denominator. Alright, now let's look at our last example. In a half a minute, Aaliyah runs 1/16 of a mile. How long does it take her to run 1 mile? So that 1 is signifying we're trying to find that unit rate. Okay, so let's set up what I have. Okay, so this is just like we just did, we've been setting up. I have 1/16 and I want to get to 1 mile. So 1/16, we're going to stick with multiplication, times what is going to equal 1. Well, what we've learned is that when we multiply by the reciprocal of a number, that's going to always give us 1. So I have 1/16 when I multiply by 16 over 1. That's going to give me 1. Okay, so now let's actually do this multiplication. Multiply by 16, which is equal to 16 over 1. Then I need to do that to the numerator as well. So whenever I do the denominator, I have to do the numerator for equivalent fractions. So here I have 1/2 times 16, or 16 over 1. And now let me multiply straight across. 1 times 16 is 16. 2 times 1 is 2. And I get 16 divided by 2. 16 divided by 2 is 8. Okay? Thus, it's going to take 8 minutes to run 1 mile, which is a pretty common good running time. 8 minutes to run 1 mile. Okay? So then I could find like my final sentence, always good to end with. It takes Aaliyah 8 minutes to run 1 mile. Right? Her unit rate is 8 minutes per mile. All right, great, good job.